The year was 1844, and a biting wind, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, swept across the desolate stretches of rural Virginia. Amelia Vance, a woman in her mid-20s with an earnest gaze and a heart brimming with ambitious ideals, shivered inside her modest travel cloak as the dilapidated stagecoach rumbled to a halt. Before her, silhouetted against a bruised leaden sky, stood Blackwood Manor. It was a structure that seemed less built and more grown from the very bedrock of the hill it occupied. A massive Gothic edifice of dark, weather-beaten stone, its numerous windows like vacant eyes staring out at a world it no longer belonged to. This was the Blackwood Orphanage, her new post, and the promise of a fresh start away from the bustling, yet stifling social circles of Richmond. She had arrived with the naive hope of bringing light and learning to forgotten children, yet the oppressive silence that clung to the manor, even from a distance, felt less like peace and more like a shroud. As Amelia stepped down into the muddy, frozen ground, her boots sinking slightly, a wave of apprehension washed over her. There was no cheerful clamor of children, no distant laughter or playful shouts that one might expect from a building housing dozens of young souls. Only the mournful groan of the ancient trees, their bare branches rattling like skeletal fingers in the wind, accompanied by the distant caw of a crow. This unnerving quiet was the first discordant note in her optimistic symphony. The manor's heavy oak door creaked open, revealing a woman whose presence seemed to amplify the existing chill. Mrs. Albright, the orphanage director, was a formidable figure, tall and gaunt, with a severe face etched with what appeared to be years of unspoken hardships. Her hair, pulled back into a severe bun, was streaked with grey, and her eyes, though sharp and intelligent, held a disconcerting flatness, devoid of warmth. She surveyed Amelia with an unblinking, almost clinical assessment. "Miss Vance, I presume." Her voice was low, raspy, like gravel shifting underfoot. "Welcome to Blackwood. I trust your journey was uneventful." Her tone was less a greeting and more a pronouncement, a warning perhaps. Amelia offered a polite, though somewhat shaky reply, trying to project an air of professionalism despite the disquiet swelling within her. As Mrs. Albright led her through the echoing, dimly lit corridors, the unsettling quiet intensified. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and something else. A faint, almost imperceptible odor that Amelia couldn't quite place, but which prickled at the back of her throat. The few lamps dotted along the walls cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch with every gust of wind outside, making the vastness of the manor feel even more claustrophobic. "Our routines here are quite strict, Miss Vance," Mrs. Albright intoned, her voice cutting through the silence. "Discipline is paramount. These girls, they require a firm hand." Amelia nodded, but her gaze kept darting to the closed doors they passed. No sounds, no whispers, not even the softest shuffle of movement. It was unnatural. "Where are the girls, Mrs. Albright?" Amelia finally ventured, her voice barely above a whisper, feeling almost disrespectful to the profound quiet. Mrs. Albright stopped abruptly, turning to face Amelia. Her expression remained impassive, but her eyes seemed to bore into Amelia's, holding a depth of unspoken things. "They are in their dormitory, Miss Vance. They prefer their solitude." The answer was unsettling. Children, especially young girls, rarely preferred solitude to play or companionship. The explanation felt like a flimsy veil over a much darker truth. They finally reached a large, austere room that Mrs. Albright announced was the dormitory. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. There were 32 beds, neatly made, and in each bed, a young girl. They sat upright or lay stiffly, their small forms almost swallowed by the rough blankets. None turned their heads as the door opened. None made a sound. Their faces, ranging from early childhood to late adolescence, were pale and unnervingly placid. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, stared blankly forward, not at Amelia or Mrs. Albright, but at some unseen point beyond the walls, beyond the room itself. A profound, chilling stillness emanated from them, a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. They don't speak?" Amelia whispered, the horror in her voice barely contained. Her initial optimism had curdled into a cold dread. Mrs. Albright gave a slow, deliberate nod. "No, not a single one. Not for nearly 6 months now. Since the night of the storm." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Amelia felt a cold tendril of fear curl in her stomach. What calamity could strike 32 children into such a profound, collective silence? Mrs. Albright offered no further explanation, only a dismissive gesture that conveyed the subject was closed. Amelia knew, with a sickening certainty, that she had stumbled into something far more sinister than a mere challenging teaching post. The silence of Blackwood Manor was not merely an absence of sound, it was a profound, terrifying presence. If you're gripped by the unsettling silence of Blackwood Manor and eager to uncover its secrets, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single chapter. This is a fictional story. Amelia's first week at Blackwood Manor stretched into an eternity of unnerving routine and escalating dread. The girls remained unresponsive, their silence a constant, oppressive weight in the dilapidated building. Each morning she would try, with renewed but quickly fading hope, to coax a sound, a flicker of recognition from them. She read stories in a soft, melodic voice, her words echoing into the vast emptiness of the dormitory. She brought them small trinkets she'd carried from Richmond, hoping a bright ribbon or a polished stone might pique their interest. She even hummed lullabies, a desperate attempt to stir some memory of comfort or joy. But their eyes, though open and seemingly focused, remained opaque, reflecting nothing of the world around them. It was as if their very souls had retreated to an unreachable place. Mrs. Albright observed these futile efforts with an air of detached amusement, her tight-lipped smile a chilling indicator that she had witnessed this struggle before. The days were spent in this silent battle, the nights filled with a different kind of torment. The manor, in its vastness and age, groaned and sighed with the wind, but Amelia began to discern more specific, unsettling sounds. Faint whispers seemed to drift from behind the walls of her own small, cold room, like distant, muffled conversations. They were indistinct, just beyond the grasp of full comprehension, but undeniably there. She'd initially dismissed them as tricks of the mind, a product of her exhaustion and the manor's eerie atmosphere. Yet they persisted, growing subtly clearer, carrying a mournful undertone. Sometimes they sounded like children's voices, hushed and terrified, or the frantic rustle of fabric. One particularly cold night, a fierce squall battered the manor, rattling the window panes in their ancient frames. As Amelia lay awake, staring at the shifting shadows on the ceiling, she heard a distinct scraping sound from the corridor outside her door, followed by a soft, dragging noise. Her heart pounded in her chest. It wasn't the natural creak of the old house. It sounded deliberate. She held her breath, straining her ears, but then the noise ceased abruptly, replaced by the familiar heavy silence. She carefully slipped out of bed, her bare feet cold against the wooden floorboards, and pressed her ear to the door. Nothing. Only the howling wind and the thumping of her own fearful heart. She returned to bed, but sleep remained elusive, haunted by the inexplicable sounds. Amelia's growing unease found its only outlet in brief, snatched conversations with Thomas, the orphanage's grizzled old caretaker. He was a stooped figure, with eyes that held the weariness of decades spent within these cold walls. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, his presence a constant, if taciturn, fixture. Amelia sensed he knew more than he let on, his silence a different kind than the girls', one born of fear and resignation. One afternoon, while he was tending to the meager vegetable patch, Amelia cautiously broached the subject that consumed her thoughts. "Thomas," she began, her voice low. "Mrs. Albright mentioned the night of the storm. What exactly happened that night?" Thomas stiffened, his gnarled hands freezing mid-motion over a clump of frozen earth. He straightened slowly, his back cracking audibly, and turned to face her. His eyes, usually downcast, met hers, wide with a flicker of raw fear. "Miss Vance," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. Some things are best left undisturbed, best forgotten." He quickly returned to his work, his movements jerky and agitated, clearly unwilling to elaborate. His reaction, however, only solidified Amelia's conviction that a terrible secret lay buried beneath Blackwood Manor's oppressive quiet. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Amelia began to explore the vast labyrinthine manor during the hours when Mrs. Albright was occupied with her ledgers and the girls were in their silent slumber. She discovered forgotten pantries, dusty storage rooms filled with generations of forgotten relics, and disused wings of the house that felt as if time itself had abandoned them. In a secluded corner of the dusty library, tucked beneath a loose floorboard, she found it. A small, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The faded script within belonged to a former teacher, a Miss Eleanor, who had taught at Blackwood decades ago. The initial entries were filled with hopeful observations, much like Amelia's own, but the tone gradually descended into one of increasing alarm. Miss Eleanor wrote of a creeping sadness among the girls, of shadows in the periphery, and voices that were not there, yet undeniably felt. The journal's final entry sent a chill down Amelia's spine, a premonition of her own fate if she wasn't careful. It read, "The silence spreads. They are losing their voices one by one. I feel a terrible presence in these walls, a suffocating weight. Mrs. Albright, she knows more than she says. I must leave before it consumes me too, before it is too late." The entry ended abruptly, the last word trailing off into a frantic, illegible scribble, leaving Miss Eleanor's fate a chilling mystery. Amelia stared at the silent girls in the dormitory, their faces pale and unmoving, and a cold certainty settled in her heart. This wasn't merely a mystery, it was a repeating pattern, a cycle of horror that threatened to consume them all. She would not abandon these girls. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The discovery of Miss Eleanor's journal was a jolt, transforming Amelia's quiet dread into a burning urgency. The cryptic warnings and the abrupt, chilling end to the previous teacher's entries painted a disturbing picture, hinting at a terrifying secret that transcended mere neglect or strict discipline. It was clear that Mrs. Albright was not just a stern director, but a keeper of a profound and sinister truth. And Amelia knew she needed to tread carefully. Every glance, every hurried movement from the other staff seemed to confirm her suspicions that Mrs. Albright maintained an iron grip on the manor, her eyes and ears seemingly everywhere. Amelia resolved to try again with Thomas, understanding that brute force or direct confrontation would only drive him further into his shell. She sought him out in the crumbling stable, where he was mending a bridle with practiced, weary hands. This time, she approached with a different tactic, offering him a small pouch of fragrant pipe tobacco she had purchased on her journey, a rare luxury in such a desolate place. Thomas's calloused hand trembled slightly as he accepted it, a flicker of genuine surprise in his eyes. This small gesture seemed to chip away at his hardened exterior, softening the years of fear and solitude. "Thomas," Amelia began softly, watching him carefully. "This journal, it speaks of things that happened before, of girls losing their voices. And it ends so suddenly. What became of Miss Eleanor? Thomas took a long, slow drag from his pipe, the smoke curling around his weathered face like a ghostly shroud. His gaze drifted to the distant, towering walls of the manor. She just left, Miss Vance, like the others. No one stays long here, not when the quiet takes hold. Or, his voice was a low murmur, filled with a deep-seated weariness that spoke of unburdened secrets. He seemed less afraid of Amelia's questions now, and more burdened by the weight of his own memories. Through a series of hushed conversations, conducted in the desolate corners of the manor, or during fleeting moments when Mrs. Albright was absent, Amelia pieced together more of Thomas's fragmented memories. He spoke of the night of the storm, with a particular dread. It had been an unusually violent tempest, he recounted, one that had plunged the entire region into darkness, cutting off the orphanage from the outside world. He remembered the ferocity of the wind, the crashing thunder, and the blinding flashes of lightning that illuminated the manor in stark, terrifying relief. But it wasn't the storm itself that haunted him. It was what had happened in the girls' dormitory during its peak. "The screams, Miss Vance," Thomas whispered, his eyes wide with a remembered horror. "They were unnatural, not like normal cries of fear, more like pure terror. And then, as sudden as the storm itself, they stopped. All of them. Just silence." He recounted how, the following morning, an eerie calm had settled over the orphanage. The girls, all 32 of them, had been found in their beds, silent and unmoving. Mrs. Albright, he revealed, had issued a chilling edict that morning. The night of the storm was never to be spoken of. Any mention, any questioning, would result in immediate dismissal, or worse, veiled threats that Amelia now recognized as a potent tool of intimidation. Thomas himself had been too terrified to disobey, his life in this remote place his only sanctuary. Amelia's suspicions solidified into a terrifying certainty. Mrs. Albright was not merely aware of what had happened, she was actively involved. Her calculated silence, her unyielding control, her veiled threats, it all pointed to a deliberate, monstrous act. Amelia knew she had to investigate the girls' dormitory more thoroughly, the very epicenter of the nightmare. She waited until the deepest hours of the night, when the manor was consumed by shadows, and the only sounds were the creaking of old timbers and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. She knew Mrs. Albright retired to her private quarters early, and Thomas, exhausted by his daily labors, would be in a deep sleep. Armed with a flickering oil lantern, its weak light casting dancing, grotesque shapes on the walls, Amelia slipped from her room. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming quiet. The air in the corridors felt thick and heavy, as if the very darkness held its breath. She reached the dormitory door, a heavy, unadorned slab of wood, and slowly, carefully, pushed it open. A profound chill descended upon her as she stepped inside. The air was stagnant, heavy with that faint, unidentifiable odor she had first noticed upon her arrival. The beds, in neat rows, seemed to loom in the semi-darkness, each one a silent sentinel to a forgotten horror. Everything appeared normal, yet a subtle disarray pricked at her attention. On the wooden floor near one of the beds, Amelia's gaze caught sight of deep, jagged scratches, as if something heavy and resistant had been violently dragged across the planks. Her heart pounded harder. This wasn't accidental damage, this was deliberate. Driven by a terrible premonition, she knelt beside the bed, shining her lantern's light under the mattress. Her breath hitched. Tucked almost out of sight, barely visible, was a small, crudely made rag doll. One of its button eyes had been torn away, leaving a vacant socket. And on its tattered fabric, a dark, dry stain. Not blood, but something else. Something earthy and sinister, like dried mud or perhaps ash. As her fingers grazed the doll, a soft, almost imperceptible creak echoed from the corridor outside. Amelia froze, every muscle tensing. The light from her lantern trembled in her hand, casting erratic shadows that danced around her like mocking spirits. Someone was coming. She shoved the doll quickly under the mattress and scrambled to conceal herself behind one of the heavy, moth-eaten curtains that framed a tall window. The dormitory door slowly, agonizingly, began to open. Amelia held her breath, the stale air thick in her lungs, listening as Mrs. Albright's tall, imposing silhouette appeared in the doorway, her eyes already sweeping the room with an unnerving intensity. The web of secrets at Blackwood Manor was tightening around Amelia, and she was now firmly caught within its terrifying threads. Amelia remained utterly still behind the thick, velvet curtain, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The air in the dormitory felt heavy with unspoken tension as Mrs. Albright entered. The director moved with a disturbing, almost predatory slowness, her eyes meticulously scanning every corner of the room. Amelia watched, rigid with fear, as Mrs. Albright stopped near the very bed where Amelia had just found the doll. The director's gaze lingered on the floorboards, seemingly examining the faint scratches Amelia had observed. For a terrifying moment, Amelia was convinced she had been discovered, that Mrs. Albright knew of her intrusion. But then, with a barely perceptible sigh, a sound of what seemed like weary frustration rather than anger, Mrs. Albright turned and slowly exited the room, the heavy door closing with a soft thud that echoed ominously in the sudden return to silence. Amelia remained hidden for several long minutes, her muscles screaming for release, before finally daring to peek out. The corridor was empty. She emerged, her body trembling with the lingering adrenaline, the silence of the dormitory now feeling more menacing than before. The rag doll, with its missing eye and the peculiar dark stain, haunted Amelia's thoughts. And the scratches on the floor, they weren't random. They suggested a specific, deliberate action, something heavy being dragged, something Mrs. Albright clearly wanted concealed. Amelia knew she couldn't continue her investigation alone. She needed an ally, someone who knew the manor's secrets and could be trusted. Thomas was her only hope. She sought him out the following morning in the vast, cold kitchen, where he was stoking the ancient hearth and preparing the girls' meager breakfast of thin gruel. The silence of the dining hall was particularly unsettling during mealtimes, as the girls ate without a sound, their spoons clinking softly against their bowls, their vacant stares unwavering. Amelia waited for a moment when they were alone, the clatter of pots and pans providing a thin veil of privacy. "Thomas," she whispered, pulling the rag doll from her cloak and showing it to him. "I found this under one of the beds in the dormitory, and there are deep scratches on the floor. What do you know about this? About the night of the storm?" Thomas's face, already pale from years of toiling in the dim light, turned ashen at the sight of the doll. His hands, gnarled and trembling, dropped the fire poker he was holding, which clattered loudly on the stone floor. His eyes widened in a mixture of terror and recognition. He cast quick, furtive glances around the empty kitchen, ensuring no one else was present. "It's hers," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "Little Ilara's. She was the youngest, the first to go silent." Thomas, visibly distressed, finally began to reveal more fragments of his suppressed memories. He recounted that on the night of the storm, amid the cacophony of the tempest, the cries of the other girls had suddenly turned to frantic, terrified screams. Ilara, a tiny, frail child of perhaps 5 or 6, had vanished from her bed. The other girls had searched for her in a terrified frenzy, but Mrs. Albright had quickly appeared, shutting down their efforts, dismissing Ilara's disappearance with a chilling nonchalance. She was taken by the spirits of the woods, Mrs. Albright had declared, her voice unnervingly calm, even amidst the storm's fury. Thomas, however, had seen Mrs. Albright that night, later, by the pale, flickering light of her lantern. He had witnessed her dragging something heavy and awkwardly shaped out of the dormitory, a dark bundle that scraped loudly against the wooden floorboards. He hadn't been able to make out what it was in the swirling darkness and the chaos of the storm, but the sound of that dragging noise, that horrible rasping, had haunted his nightmares ever since. He'd buried the memory deep, too terrified to speak of it, fearing Mrs. Albright's wrath. With this new, horrifying piece of information, Amelia urged Thomas to help her investigate the scratches more thoroughly. They returned to the dormitory, waiting until the girls were occupied with their silent lessons in another room. They examined the floor, tracing the deep gouges. The scratches led to a secluded corner of the room, behind an old, heavy built-in wardrobe that seemed unusually fixed to the wall. Amelia noticed that the wardrobe, despite its sturdy appearance, seemed to shift slightly when she pushed against it. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice filled with a new kind of urgency. "Help me move this. I think it's hiding something." With a combined effort, straining against the heavy oak, they managed to slide the wardrobe away from the wall, revealing a crudely cut, almost invisible seam in the wooden floorboards beneath it. A hidden compartment. Amelia's heart hammered as Thomas, using a small crowbar he always carried, pried open the wooden panel. Inside, nestled in the damp earth beneath the floor, was a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was dark, almost black with age, and etched with strange, unfamiliar symbols that seemed to writhe and intertwine. Amelia's hands trembled as she reached inside and pulled out the contents. It was not jewels, nor money, but a collection of deeply unsettling objects. Several locks of hair, varying in color, each tied with a faded ribbon. Small, tattered pieces of children's clothing, fragments of dresses and nightgowns. And most chillingly of all, a stack of crudely drawn children's drawings. The drawings depicted stick figures distorted and haunting, with wide, vacant eyes and mouths gaping open in silent screams. One particular drawing showed a large, shadowy figure looming over a small girl, and the girl in the drawing had no mouth at all, just a smooth, empty space where her lips should have been. A cold, visceral dread seized Amelia. The drawings were far too disturbing to be mere childhood fantasies. They were horrifyingly literal, depicting the very condition of the girls, the loss of their voices. But who was the shadowy figure? And what connection did Mrs. Albright have to these grotesque symbols and the implied rituals? The mystery deepened, twisting into something far more ancient and sinister than she could have ever imagined. Amelia knew with a horrifying certainty that she was on the verge of uncovering a truth so terrible it could shatter her very soul. Are you ready to face the escalating horror of Blackwood Manor? Don't miss the next chapter of this chilling tale. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This is a fictional story. The contents of the hidden box, the locks of hair, the fragments of clothing, and especially the terrifying silent drawings, were a direct assault on Amelia's senses. The symbols carved into the dark wooden box seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, foreign yet disturbingly familiar. Thomas, his face a mask of profound shock, stared at the objects as if they were venomous snakes. The implications were chilling. This wasn't just a case of neglect or abuse. It was something far more deliberate, a ritualistic act rooted in a deeper, more perverse agenda. Amelia instinctively knew that the symbols were key. She spent the next few days in a feverish, clandestine search through the manor's dusty, neglected library. She pored over ancient texts, forgotten theological treatises, and dusty volumes of local folklore, driven by a desperate need to decipher the meaning behind the disturbing etchings on the box. Thomas, though still visibly shaken, became her quiet, watchful accomplice, keeping an eye out for Mrs. Albright, while Amelia immersed herself in the forgotten histories of the region. Finally, in a crumbling, leather-bound tome on obscure regional cults and superstitions, Amelia found it. The symbols, intricately described, were indeed associated with a reclusive and long-forgotten sect known as the Order of the Silent Tongue. This cult, which had purportedly thrived in the isolated valleys of Virginia centuries ago, held a perverse belief that the human voice was not merely a means of communication, but the very conduit of the soul, a spiritual anchor. By silencing an individual, severing their ability to speak, often through ritualistic means, they believed they could effectively capture or purify the soul, rendering the individual a blank slate, a vessel for spiritual transcendence or, more horrifyingly, for absolute control. The cult had been violently suppressed and its members scattered or imprisoned decades ago, their practices condemned as heresy and witchcraft. Yet here were their symbols, here were their victims, living embodiments of their macabre beliefs. The last crucial piece of the puzzle clicked into place when Thomas, after much prompting, remembered a small, rarely used room in the deepest part of the manor's sprawling, stone-cold cellar. It was a place Mrs. Albright always kept locked, even from him, accessing it only sporadically, and always returning with an even more somber and distant demeanor. "She calls it her sanctuary," Thomas had whispered, his voice tinged with a deep unease. But it always felt like something else, something unholy. Amelia knew instantly that this was where the final, devastating truth resided. They waited until late evening, when the last vestiges of twilight had faded into the inky blackness of night, and Mrs. Albright's faint lamplight was no longer visible from her private quarters. Armed with a single lantern and Thomas's old rusty set of skeleton keys, they descended into the cavernous, damp cellar. The air grew colder with every step, thick with the smell of mold and decay. The cellar was a labyrinth of forgotten storerooms and crumbling foundations, but Thomas unerringly led them to a heavy, iron-bound door, almost hidden behind a stack of old barrels. The lock was ancient and stiff, but with a few turns of Thomas's practiced hand and a groan of protesting metal, it yielded. The room inside was small, even more claustrophobic than Amelia had imagined, and suffocatingly dark. The air was unnaturally still, heavy with a faint metallic scent that made Amelia's stomach churn. As Thomas held the lantern high, its light pierced the gloom, revealing a horrifying tableau. In the center of the earthen floor, a crude altar had been fashioned from rough-hewn stones. More of the ominous serpentine symbols were carved into its surface. Arranged around it were disturbing objects, a collection of dried, shriveled herbs, what appeared to be calcified animal bones, and a small glass vial containing a thick, dark, viscous liquid that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Beside the altar, partially obscured by a tattered cloth, lay another journal. This one was newer, its leather cover still relatively supple, its pages filled with neat, precise script. Amelia picked it up, her fingers trembling, and her eyes scanned the first few lines. It was Mrs. Albright's diary, and what she read sent a cold, paralyzing terror through her very bones. The entries meticulously detailed Mrs. Albright's twisted beliefs, her fanatical devotion to the resurrected Order of the Silent Tongue. She was, as Amelia had suspected, a direct descendant of one of the cult's original leaders, indoctrinated from a young age into its perverse ideology. Blackwood Manor, with its remote location and its constant influx of vulnerable, unloved children, was not merely an orphanage. It was a carefully chosen sacred site for the revival of the rituals. Mrs. Albright believed the girls were unburdened souls, perfect vessels for the purification ritual. The night of the storm was meticulously recounted, its horror laid bare on the journal's pages. The violent tempest had been seen by Mrs. Albright as a divine sign, the perfect cover for her grand undertaking. She had systematically, one by one, forced the 32 girls to consume the dark liquid from the phial, a concoction of rare, potent herbs mixed with other substances that induced a profound psychological shock, combined with chemical agents that specifically targeted and suppressed the vocal cords, rendering them temporarily or permanently impaired. The goal was not merely physical silence, but a profound spiritual and psychological breaking, turning them into the pure, malleable vessels she desired. Little Ilara, the first and most resistant to the ritual, had fought back. Mrs. Albright, in her cold fury, had punished her, dragging the child from the dormitory and imprisoning her in a place of absolute isolation within the manor, a cruel testament to her unwavering devotion to her horrifying cause. The diary spoke of grander plans, of using the silent girls for a purpose even more sinister, but the final pages were blank, leaving Amelia to wonder what further atrocities Mrs. Albright had intended. A wave of nausea washed over Amelia. Mrs. Albright was not just a strict, misguided director. She was a dangerous, deranged fanatic, a monster hiding in plain sight. The truth was far, far more horrifying than anything Amelia could have possibly imagined. The chilling reality of the silence settled around her, a suffocating presence. The revelations in Mrs. Albright's diary were a punch to Amelia's gut, stripping away any last vestiges of her naive optimism. The meticulous entries describing the forced silencing, the twisted beliefs of the Order of the Silent Tongue, and the cold, calculated cruelty solidified Mrs. Albright's image from a stern director into a chilling fanatic. A monstrous truth had been unveiled, and Amelia's resolve hardened. Her immediate priority shifted from understanding the horrors to actively combating them. She had to rescue Ilara, liberate the other girls, and expose Mrs. Albright to the world. Amelia knew, however, that confronting Mrs. Albright directly, especially after discovering the cellar's macabre secrets, would be suicidal. She needed a strategy, and she needed Thomas's unwavering assistance. Together, huddled in a hidden nook of the cellar, their voices hushed, they hastily reviewed the diary, searching for any specific clues regarding Ilara's place of absolute isolation. The descriptions were vague, but consistent with a small, seldom-used chamber, deep within the manor's forgotten corners. Thomas, with his intimate knowledge of every forgotten passage and hidden recess of Blackwood, suggested a tiny, forgotten sub-basement beneath the kitchen, accessible only through a precarious and easily overlooked trapdoor. It was a damp, lightless space, rarely visited even by him. While Thomas quietly prepared a makeshift escape route, scouting the grounds for a discreet path through the surrounding treacherous woods, Amelia decided to enact a dangerous diversion. She would confront Mrs. Albright, not with the intention of defeating her, but of distracting her, drawing her away from the dormitory and buying precious time for Thomas to gather the girls. It was a risky gamble, but a necessary one. Amelia found Mrs. Albright in her stark, sparsely furnished office, meticulously poring over ledgers by the dim light of a single lamp. The director looked up as Amelia entered, her face impassive, her eyes holding that unsettling, flat gaze. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her voice to remain steady, imbued with a newfound authority. "Mrs. Albright," Amelia began, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't entirely feel. "I know what you have done. I found your diary. I know about the rituals, about the Order of the Silent Tongue, and about what happened to the girls." Mrs. Albright's features, usually so controlled, contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Her thin lips tightened into a hard line, and her eyes, for the first time, blazed with a terrifying cold fire. She rose slowly from her chair, her imposing figure casting a long, menacing shadow across the room. "You meddling fool!" she hissed, her voice a low, venomous growl. "You have trespassed where no one ever dared. Some truths are too dangerous for the ignorant to comprehend." She took a menacing step towards Amelia, her hands clenching into fists. Amelia, anticipating her aggression, was ready. With a swift, desperate movement, she swept a stack of heavy, leather-bound books from Mrs. Albright's desk, sending them crashing to the floor with a loud, chaotic thud. The sudden noise and unexpected distraction made Mrs. Albright stumble back, momentarily disoriented. Seizing the precious seconds, Amelia bolted from the office, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind her and fumbling frantically with the old external lock. She heard Mrs. Albright's enraged roar from inside, followed by the sound of furious pounding against the sturdy door. Amelia raced through the echoing corridors, her every breath a gasp of panicked air, towards the girls' dormitory. Thomas was already there, his weathered face etched with a mixture of grim determination and urgency. He had managed to rouse the 32 silent girls, quietly herding them. He had even fashioned a crude wheeled cart, piled with blankets and cloaks, to help transport the more frail or younger girls. The girls, though still tragically silent, seemed to sense the immense stakes. Their wide eyes, no longer blank, held a flicker of understanding, a fragile glimmer of nascent hope as they followed Thomas, their small, soft, shuffling steps barely audible. The escape was a perilous, nerve-wracking ordeal. They moved like shadows through the labyrinthine manor. The muffled sounds of Mrs. Albright's frustrated shouts and the distant thud of her attempts to break free echoing faintly behind them. Thomas, with his intimate knowledge of the manor's secret passages, led them through a rarely used servant's staircase, spiraling down into the deepest recesses of the basement, towards the hidden sub-basement. The air grew colder, heavier, and permeated with the scent of damp earth. They found the hidden trapdoor Thomas had spoken of, camouflaged by a stack of old firewood. With a grunt of effort, he levered it open, revealing a dark, claustrophobic opening. Inside, huddled in the oppressive blackness of the place of absolute isolation, thin and pale but undeniably alive, was little Ilara. Amelia's heart swelled with a mixture of immense relief and profound sorrow. She knelt, pulling the tiny girl into a fierce, protective embrace. Ilara, though still utterly silent, clung to Amelia with a desperate strength, her small body trembling. It was a silent testament to a deep gratitude, a silent plea for freedom. Thomas then quickly revealed another of his secrets, a narrow, almost invisible tunnel leading from this sub-basement, a forgotten escape route used by the original builders of the manor. Leading out into the dense surrounding woods, they emerged into the frigid night air, the bitter wind biting at their faces, but Amelia felt a surge of exhilaration. They were out. The moon, a thin sliver of silver, offered scant light through the thick canopy of trees, but it was enough. They could hear Mrs. Albright's furious screams now echoing much closer from the manor, and Amelia knew their desperate flight was far from over. The chilling mystery had finally been unmasked, but the perilous journey for true freedom had only just begun. The escape from Blackwood Manor was a desperate, breathless scramble into the unknown. The moment Amelia, Thomas, and the silent procession of 32 girls emerged from the hidden tunnel, the frigid air of the Virginia wilderness bit at their exposed skin. But the cold was a minor discomfort compared to the chilling fury that now erupted from the manor behind them. Mrs. Albright, having finally broken free from her office, bellowed her rage into the night, her voice carrying unnaturally far in the still, cold air. Soon, the frantic barks of the orphanage's formidable hunting dogs joined her cries, followed by the heavy thud of footsteps as Mrs. Albright and a handful of her most loyal, brutish staff began their relentless pursuit. The dense forest was a dark, treacherous labyrinth. Ancient trees, their gnarled branches clawing at the bruised night sky, formed a suffocating canopy that swallowed the already scarce moonlight. The ground was a treacherous mosaic of exposed roots, slippery mud, and decomposing leaves, making every step a gamble. The girls, despite their trauma and physical frailty, displayed an astonishing silent resilience. Their small forms, huddled together, moved with a unified purpose, driven by the raw instinct for survival and the fragile glimmer of hope that Amelia and Thomas had ignited within them. Thomas, with his lifelong intimacy with these woods, took the lead. He navigated the shadowy terrain with an almost supernatural instinct, choosing paths that were less defined, weaving through dense thickets, and utilizing every natural concealment the forest offered. He knew every hidden gully, every trick of the land, desperate to throw their pursuers off their scent. Amelia, clutching the fragile form of Ilara to her chest, struggled to keep pace. The little girl, though silent, trembled against her, but her small hands clutched Amelia's cloak with a surprising strength, a silent plea for protection. The sounds of the chase were a terrifying symphony in the night. The distant baying howls of the dogs, now closer then fading as Thomas expertly veered off course, only to grow louder again, sending fresh waves of panic through Amelia. She could almost feel the hot breath of their pursuers on their necks. The sheer overwhelming odds threatened to crush her spirit, but the trusting eyes of the silent girls looking to her for guidance steeled her resolve. She was their last hope, their only shield against the returning darkness. They reached a wide, swiftly flowing stream, its dark, icy waters reflecting the fractured moonlight. Thomas hesitated for a moment, his brow furrowed in concern. "We must cross, Miss Vance," he rasped, his voice strained. "The current is strong, but it's our best chance to lose them. Water confuses the dog's scent." The girls eyed the churning water with apprehension, their small faces pale in the faint light, but they looked to Amelia, silently awaiting her command. There was no other choice. Thomas, using a sturdy length of rope he had foresightedly brought, quickly secured one end to a thick oak on their side and tossed the other across, where it snagged on a submerged branch. One by one, he helped the younger girls across, their tiny bodies shivering as the frigid water rose to their waists. Amelia, holding Ilara tightly, plunged into the numbing cold, focusing only on the opposite bank, on the promise of escape. The current tugged at her, threatening to pull them downstream, but she pushed through, driven by a primal need to protect the vulnerable life in her arms. Just as the last of them scrambled onto the far bank, the furious barks of the dogs erupted from the opposite side of the stream. Mrs. Albright's enraged shouts followed, her silhouette visible now through the gaps in the trees, a dark, menacing spectre against the faintest glow of the distant manor. They were too close. Amelia and Thomas knew their temporary reprieve would be short-lived. They needed to find a more secure hiding place, something more substantial than the thin veil of the trees. Thomas suddenly remembered a small, forgotten cave he had stumbled upon in his youth, hidden behind a modest waterfall further upstream. It was a local legend, a place few knew existed. "Follow me," he urged, his voice raspy with effort, pointing upstream. They pushed onward, their muscles aching, their lungs burning, driven by the terrifying proximity of their pursuers. The roar of the waterfall grew louder, a promising sound of concealment. They finally reached the waterfall, a shimmering curtain of silver in the moonlight, its constant rush providing a powerful natural screen against sound. Behind it, concealed by the spray and the rocks, was the narrow entrance to the cave. They scrambled inside, collapsing onto the cold, damp earth, gasping for breath. It was a small, cramped space, but for now, it was a sanctuary. Outside, the frantic barks of the dogs echoed, growing confused at the water's edge, their frustration palpable even through the rushing water. Mrs. Albright's enraged shouts seemed to fade, her pursuit temporarily thwarted. Amelia gazed at the silent girls, huddled together, their faces pale and exhausted, but their eyes, once vacant, now held a fragile, precious light. Ilara, nestled securely in Amelia's arms, looked up at her, a silent, trusting gaze that spoke volumes. Amelia knew the fight was far from over, but they had come this far. They would not surrender. The mystery had been unraveled, but the battle for their freedom had just begun. A silent war against a human monster. The tension is unbearable, isn't it? Will Amelia and the girls find true safety? Don't miss the thrilling conclusion to The Orphanage, where 32 girls stopped speaking forever. Subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell right now. The interior of the cave behind the waterfall was cold and damp, but its darkness offered a profound sense of temporary security against the relentless fury of Mrs. Albright and her pursuing henchmen. The roaring cascade outside was a constant, deafening curtain, muffling the sounds of the chase and making it impossible for their pursuers to pinpoint their exact location. Amelia and Thomas, exhausted but resolute, huddled with the silent girls, their breaths misting in the frigid air. They knew this refuge was fleeting. The cold would eventually become unbearable, and Mrs. Albright's persistence was a force to be reckoned with. While Thomas, ever vigilant, peered through a narrow crevice in the rocks, scanning the moonlit woods for any sign of movement, Amelia focused on the girls. She tried to offer words of comfort, quiet assurances that they were safe, that help would come. Ilara, still weak but remarkably resilient, nestled closer to Amelia, her small hand clutching Amelia's with surprising strength. The bond between them, forged in terror and shared vulnerability, had become incredibly strong. The older girls watched Amelia with a silent intensity, their wide eyes reflecting a fragile, newly born hope. Suddenly, Thomas pulled back from the crevice, his eyes wide, a mix of apprehension and disbelief on his face. He quickly put a finger to his lips, signaling silence. "Someone's coming," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the waterfall's roar. Amelia's heart leaped into her throat. Had Mrs. Albright managed to outsmart them? Had the dogs found their scent despite the water? She braced herself for the inevitable, for the nightmare to resume. But the sounds that followed were not the angry shouts of their pursuers or the baying of the hounds. Instead, Amelia heard the distinctive, rhythmic creak of wagon wheels on a rough track, accompanied by the faint, muffled sounds of a human voice humming a tuneless melody. Thomas's tense expression slowly softened, transforming into a look of profound relief. "It's Mr. Henderson," he exclaimed, a low, grateful laugh escaping his lips. "It's a miracle." Mr. Henderson was a local farmer, a gruff but kind-hearted man known for his solitary nature and his meticulous care of his land. Thomas had known him for years, a quiet neighbor in this sparsely populated region. By an extraordinary stroke of luck, Mr. Henderson was returning from selling his produce in a distant market town. The violent storm of the previous night had washed out a section of his usual, more direct road, forcing him to take a rarely used circuitous route that coincidentally passed perilously close to the very stream where Amelia and the girls were hiding. Thomas quickly emerged from the cave, waving frantically to get the farmer's attention. Mr. Henderson, a man of few words but keen observation, squinted through the semi-darkness, his lantern casting long shadows. Upon seeing Thomas and then Amelia, haggard and accompanied by a multitude of silent, wide-eyed children, his weathered face creased with concern. Thomas, speaking in urgent, hushed tones, quickly recounted the horrific tale of Mrs. Albright's depravity, the forced silence of the girls, and their desperate escape. Mr. Henderson, a man whose life revolved around the simple, honest rhythms of the land, listened with growing horror. Without a moment's hesitation, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "Get him in the wagon, Thomas," he instructed, his voice low and steady. "Quickly now. We'll get them to my farm. No one should suffer such wickedness." With astonishing speed and a shared sense of urgency, they carefully loaded the girls into the back of Mr. Henderson's sturdy, hay-filled wagon. The girls, though still tragically mute, understood the significance of this unexpected lifeline. Their small bodies, shivering from the cold and exhaustion, burrowed into the hay, and beneath the rough blankets Mr. Henderson quickly provided, camouflaging them perfectly. Amelia and Thomas likewise concealed themselves amongst the market produce, their hearts pounding with a fragile hope. Mr. Henderson, with a deliberate calm that belied the urgency of the situation, clicked his tongue to his horse, and the wagon slowly began to rumble away from the waterfall. They had barely traveled a mile along the treacherous track when, from behind them, the furious shouts of Mrs. Albright and her men, along with the baying of their confused hounds, erupted once more. The sound was chillingly close. Mrs. Albright's tall, menacing silhouette appeared on the path behind them, her lantern swinging wildly. "Henderson, have you seen anything, man?" she shrieked, her voice raw with frustrated fury. Her eyes, burning with a psychotic intensity, swept over the wagon, lingering for a terrifying moment on the pile of hay and sacks. Mr. Henderson, however, was a master of his quiet, unassuming demeanor. He pulled his horse to a leisurely halt, feigning weariness. "Just the road home, Mrs. Albright," he replied, his voice a slow, deliberate drawl, his expression placid and innocent. "A long night of selling. It's too cold for a lady like yourself to be out roaming these woods." He even stifled a fake yawn. Mrs. Albright, consumed by her own rage and the certainty that her property had vanished into the dense woods, snarled in frustration. With a dismissive wave of her hand, she turned and led her men deeper into the forest, convinced her prey had gone another way. A collective silent sigh of relief rippled through the wagon. The girls, hidden beneath the hay, remained perfectly still, but Amelia felt their small bodies tremble with a profound sense of deliverance. The close call had been terrifying, but they were safe, at least for now. Amelia felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude for Mr. Henderson, a simple, kind man who, without question or personal gain, had risked everything to help a group of desperate, silent children. Mr. Henderson drove them to his modest but warm and welcoming farm. His wife, a woman with a gentle face and eyes that held deep compassion, gasped softly upon seeing the silent girls emerge from the wagon. She ushered them inside, immediately stoking the fire and preparing a simple, nourishing meal of warm broth and bread. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the girls were truly safe, far from the suffocating darkness of Blackwood Manor. This moment of quiet respite, the warmth of the hearth and the gentle kindness of strangers, was a balm to their traumatized souls. Amelia knew that the battle for justice against Mrs. Albright was still ahead, a legal and moral reckoning, but the most crucial victory had been secured. The girls were finally irrevocably free. The Henderson farm became a haven for the girls' healing. Mrs. Henderson's patience and the farm's rhythmic sounds slowly eased their minds. Their eyes gained curiosity, their movements relaxed. Meanwhile, Amelia and Thomas used Mrs. Albright's diary and Mr. Henderson's testimony to seek justice. The community, initially skeptical, was shocked by the overwhelming evidence. Mrs. Albright was arrested at Blackwood Manor, her silence mirroring that of her victims. The trial exposed her cruelty. She was found guilty of abduction and harm, sentenced to life. Blackwood Manor, condemned, was swiftly demolished. The girls' healing was a long, complex journey. Young Ilara was the first to show a breakthrough. One morning, as Amelia read, a faint whisper escaped her lips, the first sound since the night of the storm. It was a miracle, a fragile promise of hope. Over time, some girls regained their voices with Amelia's care, though often hesitant. Others remained silent, but found profound ways to communicate through sign language and art, forming an unbreakable bond. Amelia dedicated her life to them, establishing a school at the farm. The mystery was solved, justice served, and a new dawn broke for these resilient young women. Decades later, Blackwood Manor's land was cleared, replaced by wildflowers. The Henderson farm became a thriving community, a true sanctuary. Amelia Vance, now older but still full of compassion, remained the matriarch. Her school blossomed, becoming a renowned institution for traumatized children. The girls who recovered their voices became teachers, artists, and healers, their survival inspiring countless others. Ilara, whose voice never fully returned due to irreversible damage, became an astonishing painter. Her vibrant art depicted her past and enduring hope, speaking volumes without words. For those who remained silent, their silence became a language of intricate sign and profound understanding, embraced with respect by the community. Thomas, the loyal caretaker, lived out his years at the farm, a beloved, quiet presence. Mrs. Albright remained incarcerated, lost in her delusions. Her dark legacy could not extinguish the vibrant light Amelia and the girls had kindled. On a warm spring afternoon, Amelia sat in the field where Blackwood Manor once stood, Ilara painting beside her. The silence between them was deep, comfortable. The echoes of the past were faint scars, a testament to survival. The future stretched ahead, a vibrant symphony of life, hope, and a new dawn. The story of the 32 girls became a powerful narrative of resilience, compassion, and the human spirit's triumph over evil. This incredible journey through the orphanage where 32 girls stopped speaking forever has reached its poignant conclusion. If you were captivated by Amelia's courage and the girls' resilience, and you want to experience more gripping stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This is a fictional story,